On my birthday, I got a message from Dad. Sold your tablet. Your sister needs a new laptop. Be grateful we feed you. Then he added, also, you'll pay his tuition, $6,000 by the next weekend. I stated, no chance. He responded, then leave. You're cut off. So I departed quietly. The next morning, they found what I left on the table. Now my sister's panicking, my mom's screaming, and my dad's contacting every number he knows. I, 22M, never expected my birthday to become the day everything changed forever. What started as a typical Tuesday morning in our cramped apartment turned into the moment I finally understood where I truly stood in my family's hierarchy. The message came through while I was reviewing for my computer science midterms. Dad's text was blunt and matter-of-fact, the way he always communicated when he'd already made up his mind about something. He told me he'd sold my tablet, the one I'd saved up for over 6 months working double shifts at the campus bookstore, because my sister needed a new laptop for her art classes. He said I should be grateful they still fed me, as if basic parental obligations were some kind of charity. But that wasn't the end of it. The follow-up message hit like a sledgehammer. Dad informed me that I'd also be covering my sister's tuition payment of $6,000 by the following weekend. The casual way he dropped this financial bomb on me, like he was asking me to pick up milk from the store, made my blood run cold. I stared at my phone screen, reading the message 3 times before the reality sank in. $6,000. That was more money than I'd ever seen in one place, let alone had sitting in my bank account. I was a full-time student working part-time jobs just to cover my own expenses and contribute to household bills. My response was immediate and firm. I told him there was no chance I could come up with that kind of money. The reply came back within minutes, and it was exactly what I should have expected from him. He told me to leave then, that I was officially cut off from any family support. For a moment, I just sat there in my tiny room, surrounded by textbooks and the scattered remnants of what I'd thought was my life. This wasn't the first time Dad had threatened to kick me out, but something about the timing, on my birthday, no less, and the sheer audacity of demanding I pay my sister's tuition made me realize this was different. I'd been the family's backup plan for years. When money got tight, I was the one who picked up extra shifts. When household bills needed paying, my part-time income somehow became fair game for family expenses. When my sister wanted something new, my belongings mysteriously became available for sale or redistribution. The pattern was so established that I'd stopped questioning it. But sitting there on my 22nd birthday, being told to cough up $6,000 or get out, something inside me finally snapped. I started packing immediately. Not the angry, dramatic kind of packing where you throw things around and slam drawers. This was methodical, careful packing. I took only what was truly mine. Clothes I'd bought with my own money, textbooks I'd purchased for school, my laptop that I'd specifically hidden from Dad's previous selling sprees. As I packed, I thought about all the times I'd enabled this dynamic. Every time I'd handed over my paycheck to help with rent, every time I'd let them sell my stuff for my sister's benefit, every time I'd swallowed my frustration and told myself it was just temporary. I realized I'd been subsidizing their poor financial decisions while they took credit for raising such a responsible son. But I wasn't just angry about the money or the tablet. What really got to me was the complete lack of respect. The assumption that I existed solely to serve the family's needs, that my own goals and struggles were irrelevant. The fact that Dad could demand thousands of dollars from me on my birthday without even a conversation about whether it was possible. The decision to leave wasn't dramatic in my head. It felt logical, inevitable even. I was already supporting myself financially while contributing to their household expenses. The only thing keeping me there was some misguided sense of family obligation that clearly wasn't reciprocated. I finished packing around midnight. 3 duffel bags and a backpack. That's all I owned that I could definitively call mine. As I prepared to leave, I realized I had one last thing to do. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a notebook. For the next hour, I wrote down every financial transaction I could remember from the past 4 years since I'd started working. Every payment I'd made toward rent and utilities. Every time Dad had borrowed money from me that never got repaid. Every possession of mine that had been sold or given away without my consent. The numbers were staggering. Over 4 years, I'd contributed more than $30,000 to the household, not counting the value of items that had been taken from me. I'd been so focused on daily survival that I'd never added it all up before. But the list wasn't just about money. I wrote down every time I'd been voluntold to babysit my sister's kids while she went out. Every family gathering where I'd been expected to help cook and clean while she was treated like a guest. Every time my achievements had been minimized while her mediocre efforts were celebrated. I wasn't bitter about helping family. That's what families do. But this wasn't mutual support. This was systematic exploitation disguised as family responsibility. When I finished writing, I had 12 pages of documentation. I made copies of everything, including receipts and bank statements I'd kept from major contributions. Then I created a simple spreadsheet breaking down exactly how much money I'd put into the family over the years, with a calculated interest rate for good measure. I left the original documentation in a manila envelope on the kitchen table with a note. I kept the copies for my own records. The note was brief. I explained that since they'd officially cut me off, I was simply accepting their decision and removing myself from the equation. I included a breakdown of what I'd contributed financially over the years and stated that since we were severing ties, I'd be expecting repayment of the outstanding balance with reasonable interest. I wasn't actually expecting them to pay me back, but I wanted them to see, in black and white, exactly what they were losing when they decided I was expendable. The final paragraph outlined my terms for any future contact. If they wanted me back in their lives, it would be as an equal family member, not as a convenient source of labor and money. No more forced financial contributions, no more selling my belongings without permission, no more expectations that I'd subsidize poor decisions. I left that night without saying goodbye, not out of spite, but because I knew any conversation would devolve into guilt trips and manipulation tactics that had worked on me for years. I was done being manipulated. I crashed on my friend Mike's couch for the first week. Mike had seen how my family treated me and had been telling me for months that I needed to get out. He didn't even seem surprised when I showed up with my bags. Update 1. The first call came at 7 a.m. the next morning. It was Mom, and Mike handed me his phone with a grim expression. She was crying and screaming simultaneously, asking how I could do this to the family, how I could abandon them when they needed me most. I let her talk for a few minutes before I responded. I told her I hadn't abandoned them. They'd told me to leave. I was simply doing what Dad had instructed. The silence that followed was deafening. She tried a different approach then, talking about how family sticks together through tough times, how my sister really needed that laptop for school, how they'd always been there for me. I listened patiently and then asked her to name one time in the past 4 years when they'd helped me with anything without expecting something bigger in return. The conversation ended when I told her I'd left a detailed accounting of my contributions to the family on the kitchen table and suggested she review it before we talked again. Dad called an hour later. The tone was completely different, aggressive, demanding, threatening. He told me I was making a huge mistake, that I'd never survive on my own, that I'd come crawling back within a week. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. I stayed calm and asked him to explain how expecting me to pay $6,000 for my sister's tuition was reasonable when I was already struggling to pay my own expenses. I asked him to walk me through the logic of selling my belongings without permission to buy things for other family members. He couldn't answer either question without admitting that he'd been taking advantage of me, so he hung up instead. My sister called that afternoon. This conversation was the most revealing of all. She started by trying to guilt trip me about leaving the family in a tough spot, but when I pressed her on specifics, the truth came out. She admitted she'd known Dad was planning to sell my tablet for weeks. She'd actually been the one to suggest it, figuring I didn't really need it since I had a laptop for school. She also revealed that the $6,000 wasn't just for tuition. She wanted to upgrade to a more expensive program that included additional art supplies and studio time. The most shocking revelation was that she'd always assumed I enjoyed helping the family financially. She genuinely thought I was happy to work extra shifts to pay for her things because that's what big brothers do. The concept that I might have my own financial goals and limitations had never occurred to her. When I explained that I'd been sacrificing my own needs for years to help support everyone else, she seemed genuinely surprised. She'd been so insulated from the family's financial struggles that she didn't realize how much pressure I'd been under. Update 2. By the end of the first week, the calls had become more frequent and more desperate. Dad had started reaching out to extended family members, trying to get them to convince me to come back. What he hadn't anticipated was that most of them already knew about the family dynamics and were sympathetic to my situation. My aunt called to check on me, and she mentioned that Dad had been calling relatives asking for money to cover my sister's tuition. Apparently, he'd been telling people that I'd selfishly abandoned the family right when they needed me most, without mentioning that he'd told me to leave or demanded I pay thousands of dollars. But my aunt had always been observant. She noticed over the years how I was always working while my sister seemed to have unlimited spending money for art supplies and social activities. She'd seen how family gatherings always involved me helping in the kitchen while my sister was treated like a guest. She told me that several family members had been wondering when I'd finally stand up for myself. The fact that Dad was now desperately calling around for money proved that my financial contributions had been more significant than anyone realized. The second week brought a new strategy from my parents. Mom started sending long text messages about how much they missed me, how empty the house felt without me, how sorry they were that things had gotten so heated. She avoided mentioning the financial demands or the fact that Dad had told me to leave. I responded once, thanking her for the sentiment, but reminding her that I was simply following Dad's instructions. I told her that if they wanted to have a real conversation about rebuilding our relationship, I'd be open to it, but it would have to include acknowledgement of what had actually happened and genuine changes in how they treated me. Dad's approach was different. He started calling me from different numbers, including work phones and borrowed cells from friends. Each call followed the same pattern. He'd start by demanding I come home immediately, then shift to threats about cutting off my car insurance or removing me from the family health plan, then eventually devolve into accusations that I was tearing the family apart. I remained calm during these calls, but I also started documenting them. I kept notes about the threats, the attempts at manipulation, and the various versions of events he presented. The pattern that emerged was clear. He was used to controlling me through financial pressure and emotional manipulation, and my absence had left him scrambling. Update 3. 3 weeks after leaving, I got the call I'd been expecting. My sister was panicking because the tuition deadline was approaching and Dad hadn't been able to come up with the money. Without my financial contributions, the household budget had fallen apart faster than anyone anticipated. She called me crying, begging me to come back and help them figure things out. She promised things would be different, that Dad had learned his lesson, that they'd treat me better. But when I asked her to be specific about what would change, she couldn't give me concrete answers. I told her I was willing to help her create a realistic budget and look into financial aid options for her program, but I wasn't going to just hand over money to maintain the dysfunctional family dynamic. I offered to help her apply for student loans and grants, and to teach her about managing money responsibly. Her response was telling. She didn't want to learn about budgeting or take on student loans. She wanted me to come back and solve the problem the way I always had, by sacrificing my own needs for everyone else's convenience. Mom called later that day with a different approach. She wanted to negotiate. She offered to have Dad return my tablet and promised that they wouldn't sell my belongings anymore. She said they'd be more careful about asking for financial help in the future. I appreciated the attempt at compromise, but I pointed out that she was essentially offering to treat me with basic respect, as if it was a special favor. I explained that I wasn't looking for negotiations or promises. I was looking for fundamental changes in how they viewed my role in the family. The turning point came when my cousin called me. He'd been at a family dinner where Dad had been complaining about my selfishness and demanding that relatives pressure me to come home. My cousin had finally spoken up, asking Dad to explain exactly what had happened. When Dad reluctantly admitted that he'd told me to leave after I refused to pay my sister's tuition, the room had gone silent. When pressed for details about the $6,000 demand and the sold tablet, several family members had walked out. My cousin told me that the extended family was finally seeing the full picture of how I'd been treated, and many of them were angry on my behalf. The narrative Dad had been trying to create about me abandoning the family was falling apart as people learned the truth. Final update. 2 months later, I was settled into a shared apartment with Mike and another friend from school. My grades had actually improved without the constant stress of family financial dramas, and I'd picked up additional tutoring work that paid better than my old bookstore job. The desperate calls from home had gradually decreased as the reality of their situation set in. My sister had ended up taking out student loans for a more affordable program. Dad had been forced to take on additional work to cover the bills I'd been helping with. Mom had started working part-time for the first time in years. The interesting thing was that the family actually seemed to be functioning better in some ways. Without me as a safety net, they'd been forced to make more responsible financial decisions. My sister was learning to budget for the first time in her life. Dad couldn't make impulsive purchases knowing that I wouldn't be there to cover shortfalls. I wasn't completely estranged from them. I'd had a few careful conversations with Mom, and she seemed to be genuinely reflecting on how they'd treated me. She admitted that they'd taken advantage of my willingness to help and that they'd never properly appreciated what I'd been contributing. My sister had even reached out to apologize for her role in the situation. She said that having to handle her own finances had made her realize how much pressure I'd been under for years. She was working part-time now and seemed to be developing a better understanding of money and responsibility. Dad was the holdout. He'd called once to demand that I return the family documents I'd taken, apparently not understanding that the bank statements and receipts I'd kept were records of my own transactions. He still seemed to view my departure as betrayal rather than a natural consequence of his ultimatum. But I wasn't waiting for his approval anymore. I'd learned that you can't force people to treat you with respect. You can only control how you respond when they don't. Setting boundaries had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Looking back, I realized that my 22nd birthday had actually been a gift, even though it hadn't felt like it at the time. Dad's ultimatum had forced me to choose between continuing to enable dysfunction or standing up for myself. For the first time in years, I'd chosen myself. The family was still intact, just restructured around healthier dynamics. And I was finally free to build the life I wanted instead of constantly managing everyone else's problems. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to play a rigged game.